Hello, everyone. I'm Ana Margarida Ferreira, and it's a pleasure to be here and welcome you for the second colloquium of Porto Design Biennale conference. I'm here presenting, I have the honor to present this colloquium and presenting and helping to explore this theme. Of course, I work with colleagues and friends, a steering committee that I want to present also, namely António Gurgel Pinto, also a colleague from IAD Universidade Europeia, Maria Milano from esad, Paolo Reais Pinto from Universidade de Évora, Tom Billing from Berlin, and Virginia Tassari from Italy. And of course, all of us well inspired and led by Alastair Fadlook. So my responsibility now here is exactly to thank you for caring. I must start for saying that and for enjoying this moment, I hope. And of course, I should for start to talk a little bit, presenting the idea that is under this colloquium. So, having as title, Caring for Diverse Kinship, is the idea, our understanding and belief, I would say, that beyond disciplinary knowledge, it is possible to find uncommon realities which can be perceived by other perspectives in a given time and space. These trajectories of thinking may converge into definitions of new strategies to implement the innovations to our planet, really needs for a sustainable and holistic development. At different local, regional, and global scales, what is at stake is how design can establish different kinships with human, non-human, or more than human ways of being. A rhizomatic approach combining human, biophysical, geographical, economical, political, social, cultural, historical, and ecological aspects of life as a whole, from human-centered to life-centered design and beyond. So it's the motto of our debate and for being here. And to go through it and to enjoy it, I want to present and welcome for sure our moderator. Thank you for your availability. I want to present Teresa Franqueira. I would say that everyone already knows her very well all over the world, but nevertheless, I have to formally present it. So Teresa Franqueira is a designer and associate professor at Universidade de Aveiro. She is director and scientific coordinator of Design Factor Aveiro and international coordinator of DESI's network, Design for Social Innovation and Sustainability. She is also a member of several scientific committees in national and international design conference and jury of international design competitions. She teaches across Europe and Asia and has been the local coordinator of Erasmus Plus projects for social innovation, circular economy, and sustainability. Teresa has been invited as keynote speaker in national and international conference and has organized several workshops worldwide. She has been supervising PhD and master students within the topics of design for social innovation, design for sustainability, product design, and service design. So thank you so much, Teresa, for being here, and it's your spot.
Thank you, Ana Margarida. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be the moderator of this discussion with Ana Margarida on my side. Our session will take 2 hours, and during the first one, we will have a 45-minute keynote from Arturo Escobar, followed by a 15-minute of Q&A. After that, Paolo, Cascone, Yanki and Martin Ávila will speak for 15 minutes each, and at the end we will have a 15-minute Q&A. The colloquium is being streamed in YouTube, so feel free to ask your questions there. So let me introduce our keynote speaker, Arturo Escobar. Arturo is an anthropologist and an activist researcher from Cali in Colombia and has been working on territorial struggles against extractivism, post-developmentalist and post-capitalist transitions and ontological design. He was professor of anthropology and political ecology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, until 2018, and is currently affiliated with PhD program in design and creation at the Universidad de Caldas, Manizales in Colombia, and the PhD program in environmental sciences at the Universidad del Valle in Cali. He is currently working on a book on relationality, designing rationality, making and restoring life with Michał Worstel and Kriti Sharma. I think I pronounce it correctly. So Arturo has been challenging the design community to refigure current design practices as a way to lead to the creation of more just and sustainable social orders. I will leave now the floor to Arturo for his keynote against terricide, designing as a praxis of caring for the web of life. Arturo, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Teresa and Margarida, for the introduction. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here in this session at the Biennale. And I'd like to thank Antonio and Alistair for their invitation. Obviously, all the organizers, Joanna, Virginia, Tom, and so forth, and of course, Martin and Yanki and Paolo for sharing this session with me. And what I'd like to do today can be summarized with 3 propositions that I'm going to explain at some length in the next 45 minutes. And the first proposition is a well-established one, which is that already Teresa mentioned and Margarida, facing a civilizational crisis. And this is the concept that was introduced by indigenous peoples in Latin America at around 1992, meaning by that a crisis of a particular mode of being and doing, of existence, Western capitalistic, patriarchal, and so forth. And that as such, it calls for large-scale or significant socio-ecological transitions. And there is a lot of thinking about transitions today. The second point is that such transitions, the goal of these transitions should be the reconstitution, healing, and caring for the web of life, the web of interconnectedness and interdependencies that make up the bodies, places, and the planet that we inhabit and we are. And that for that task, we have a new guiding principle or paradigm, which is the paradigm of relationality or the radical interdependence among everything that exists. So I will explain what that concept of relationality as well. And the third point, of course, is about design. The design is deeply implicated in both the crisis and the transitions. And that the most fruitful way to see that is to rethink design in ontological terms, to adopt or develop an ontological perspective on designing. So that's going to be the third point, so that we arrived at the conception of life-centered design, which is what convenes this session at the Biennale. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully that will work well and quickly. I hope everybody's seeing the screen now. Can you see it?
Very well.
Wonderful. Okay, so the title of the talk is Against Terricide, Designing as a Praxis of Caring for the Web of Life. And I'm going to start with terricide, and in a moment, this is sort of what I already mentioned. So we talk about terricide transitions, and we talk about design, and then we talk about 6 axes for transitions, which are principles that emerge mostly from social movements in Latin America, but I think can be relevant to many different parts of the world. Okay, in the conclusion, something about life-centered design, again, the topic in the description of the session. If I have time at the end, I'll talk a little bit about this image from Zapatista art, which is in a way, a summary of it. It depicts the civilization of death, so to speak, which is here summarized by Monsanto, that is impacting the world, or the multiple worlds that exist in the planet. Here, the worlds of Mexican peasants who defend themselves, and this is the metaphor of the caracol, or the snail. Okay, so the concept of terricide. I want to start with this because I think it's a very powerful concept. It's more interesting to me than the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is also important, but the Anthropocene lends itself still to managerial and techno-scientific solutions that will not be sufficient to stem the terricide. So the terricide is a concept proposed by the movement for indigenous women for buen vivir in South America that originated with Mapuche women in the Wallmapu, the Mapuche territory. And it's an amazing concept. It's been developed over the past 5 years or so that insists that the terricide is not the killing of the earth in a physical sense, but in the spiritual sense, or the spiritual ecosystems. And they are summoning all people to build a new civilizational metrics that embraces buen vivir. And buen vivir is this idea emerging from South America, which is not development, which is collective well-being, which is the well-being of the planet and all its beings in it. And so we'll stay with this concept as we move along in the lecture, but I encourage everybody to look for it. Most of it is in Spanish, but there is a few things in English already. Okay, so this is terricide as well. This is a plantation, agrofuel plantation of oil palm. This is also the face of terricide. This is sugarcane monoculture in my region in Colombia, which has been devastated by 100 years of cultivation of sugarcane and cattle raising. This is also terricide, the expansion of digital technologies, not only, as we know, because of the plundering of the earth and this amazing large-scale extractive operations of minerals that have to go on and will have to go on. Now we know about electric cars, for instance, how the scramble for minerals is going on to fuel the batteries of the electric cars of the future or of the present, but also because of its impact on the kind of ontological extraction on how we are as human beings today, which raises the question articulated by Flores and Winograd from the beginning, which is, what does it mean to live well in the age of computer network technology? Dimeji Nafua, who is a transition designer, has rearticulated that, and I will come back to that shortly, saying that we need to ask again the question of what does design, how does design enables this kind of living and our ways of living? And is this what we want, or do we want something different maybe? So what is driving this civilizational crisis? One of the pillars of the civilizational crisis is this idea of the dualist ontology, which is based, and this is well known, of course, on the separation between us and them, and the West and the rest, and mind and body, and so forth, which has created a way of being which is based on these ideas, these beliefs, because they are beliefs that we are individuals who exist in economies, market economies, and endowed with rights. And these rights are guaranteed by the state, and that we have one truth, which is the truth of science, and we live in a world, in a single world that we all share, even if we name it in different ways. And these today have become this a very toxic loop of existence. That existence that is based again on the idea of separation, of individuals separated from communities, the economy separated from the rest of social life, etc., etc. The idea of one single world. So the response to that has been the call for civilizational transitions, and other world is possible, and especially the Zapatista definition of the pluriverse as a world where many worlds fit. That we need to move from this idea of a single globalized, marketized world in terms of global capitalism and so forth, to a pluriverse, a multiplicity of socio-ecological configuration. what is the principle that we need to begin to think more seriously about in terms of the pluriverse, in terms of the transition, is this idea, of course, of relationality, that we are not separate from the rest of the universe, that we live within a living cosmos. I like this art. Art, there's a lot of art today depicting relationality and relational ways of being, that we are also not just human, we are mountain, and we are water, and we are microbes, and we are all the things that exist in the universe. So that this principle of relationality or radical interdependence is emerging as a kind of a new paradigm. It's not new, I mean, it's just re-emerging for understanding life in a very profound sense. And I think that's at the basis of what we call caring for diverse kinship in this session. Is at the basis of the South African concept of Ubuntu, Southern African concept of Ubuntu. I exist because you exist, I am because you are, and we're going to see more instantiations of that in a moment. This amazing quote from Martin Luther King Jr., I'm not going to read it all, and in general, I'm not going to read what is on the slides. I'm just sort of paraphrase of talk around the slides. But this one is so important that I'll read some of it. It says, all life is interrelated, and we are all caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality. And then at the end, he says, this is the interrelated structure of reality. So this is an ontological statement. This is a statement about the real. So Martin Luther King is saying reality is interdependence through and through. It's not separation. It's not, intrinsically separate entities as objects and subjects that we imagine them to be in the modern life. And so relationality takes place in the context of this ontological and epistemic domain in which we exist today for the most part, some more than others, obviously, which the Jamaican philosopher Sylvia Wynter calls a monocultural notion of the human. What she means by that is that we are stuck with one single idea of the human, this idea of the human that has been expanding, since the Renaissance to the rest of the world, bourgeois, secular, patriarchal, liberal mode of being human, and that we have to move from that mode of being human to a more ecumenical, hybrid version of human, where multiple kinds of humans become possible. So there's this struggle for relationality then. It's about how do we recover the capacity for making life in a relational way, as opposed to outsourcing the making of life, as we, for the most part, do today, to experts, to corporations, to everybody else. And the field of social struggles, if we look at struggles against extractive operations by indigenous peoples, peasants, in many parts of the world, worldwide, in urban areas as well, we see that in many ways what is at stake is the defense of that fabric of life, that web of life, that relational web of life. These are some of the sources for relational thinking today. There are many, 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 from indigenous cosmovisions to post-dualist social theory, to theories of complexity and emergence, autopoiesis. The return of the sacred and spirituality is very important in this relation. Art, of course, there are lots of art of relationality. And there is a new lexicon, rhizomes, rhizomatic, mycelia. I like the image of mycelia from these new kinds of takes on forest consciousness and forests as living entities, but also interexistence, interaction, commons, commoning. All of these concepts point at this different foundation for life, which is relationality. So moving quickly to a short section on design, and beginning, as I said, in the beginning, with the idea that design is part of the crisis, but also can be part of the transition. That design should construe itself, we should construe designing as in crisis, so that we can see design as being at the service of the larger transition, the civilizational transition. But that in order to do that, we have to see design's ontological dimension and how design, for the most part, this is one of Tony Fry's main points, has contributed to the futuring, meaning by that, to doing away with any kind of future that is not the single future that is offered to us by the dominant social and economic and political systems in the world. So design is in crisis, and again, we need to see how design is central to the planetary crisis by looking at design's ontological situatedness. And so that design, and as Tony Fry puts it, can contribute to creating the conditions for a new way of being human. And that's precisely what is at stake, I think, in the concept of ontological designing, and that many people today are aiming towards that we need to rethink the human in theory and in practice. It is not enough to just do it in theory, we have to do it in practice, and design is ideally situated for that project. So why is this an ontological? I still like this definition of ontological design from '86, from Winograd and Flores' book, that design is ontological because in designing tools, and tools can be many things, from buildings to discourses to institutions to services, we are designing ways of being. Anne-Marie's very well-known formulation that we design our worlds and the world designs us back, design designs, applies to cities, applies to almost everything. Two of the landmarks of ontological design literature, Winograd and Flores, and Tony Fry's 1999 book, just reissued in the series Designing in Dark Times. And then, so what I think we're seeing is the emergence of this very complex field. I call it the transnational critical design studies field, that has somewhat different emphasis in the global north and in the global south. But it is very exciting that these emphases are beginning to converge and converge in many different ways. And some of them are there. Obviously, design for social innovation, transition design is very important. Design justice, and I'm not going to name people because it would take a lot of time to name all of the important people that are behind many of these tendencies. From the South, decolonizing design, decolonial design, designs from the South, etc., etc. So for me, the main point about design is that really design, from design studies itself, from these tendencies, is emerging as a domain of thinking and action that is concerning the production of life and the making of worlds. Again, it's a very, in a sense, if you wish, a political ontology of design, a political technology of design that is about creating. This is an early definition of relational design by Alistair that I wanted to quote, since Alistair is our curator for the Biennale. I'll just read the beginning. This Alistair says, relational design is an evolving set of design practices which found or established the theoretical and practical directionality on the whole of human and non-human interaction and interaction, and then derives, of course, ethical implications from that. So this is already infused with an ontological understanding and also coming from science and technology studies as well. So today we can see how then this transnational critical design studies field intersects with all the sources of relationality, not only post-dualist social theory, but that's one of the main ones. And for instance, if we take Ezio Mancini's and Teresa and Virginia Tassinari's work at DESIS, and all the DESIS work on transformative social innovation, we see that we can arrive at formulations that, just a second, please, such as this one that was developed out of the DESIS philosophy talks on nature, and that we utilize also for the participatory design conference in Colombia in about a year ago, that when we ask already what would be a non-anthropocentric design look like, and one that not only embraces radical interdependence, but also is capable of operating effectively in the reality of the contemporary world. And that's what design adds to the theoretical debate, which is how do we engage in a practice, develop a practice that really tries to give flesh and content to this idea of non-anthropocentric designing. A recent lecture by Dimeji Onafuwa, a transition and social designer, it was about a month ago. I encourage you all to look at the lecture. He complements very well this idea. What are the implications of relational designing, pluriversal designing, when he says, and he understands it in this way, what are we designing, ontologically speaking? What do we do when we design objects, institutions, services, transitions? How does it contribute to supporting justice, or how do we mitigate the undermining of different worlds and ways of world making? And then he spells it out in a series of criteria, which I find very interesting, that of course I don't have the time to explain here, but I encourage you all to look for the lecture in your own time. And I found this to be very provocative and very useful in moving us along the lines of thinking about pluriversal designing or relational designing. A challenge that I find very important coming from the South, this is from Alfredo Gutierrez, a good friend and colleague in Bogota, Colombia, that is been inviting us to see not only that there are other designs in multiple forms of designs in the South, and decolonial design theories and practitioners are also engaged in this argument about designs from the South, and also warning us not only about not bringing the rest of the world into design, for instance, through development, but also about thinking in terms of alternatives to design, not only designing otherwise or alternative designs, but alternatives to design, and thinking about so many practices that historically and today have gone on in the world. Design practices of prefiguration and artifice and making that do not how do you say, do not conform to any modern Western definition of designing, but so that we shouldn't even be calling design, but and then becoming aware of what Alfredo called designorance, the ignorance that design has, and the ignorance that is ignorant about that ignorance about designing in other parts of the world, in other regions of the world. So that's what he calls design with another names and so forth, and active design. The examples that I bring here, from the very beautiful and famous mosque in Genève. I bring it up because I was once there, actually, in front of the mosque. It's an amazing structure that has been built and rebuilt since the 15th century, if I recall correctly. This is an example from bridges that are made out of root trees in the Amazon. And there are hundreds of examples, certainly from architecture, and things that we shouldn't even be calling architecture, even if they are also architecture at the same time. So to summarize Alfredo Gutierrez's position, he says modern design monopolizes the relationship with tomorrow under the idea of project. So the question is there design without project, or can there be a design without project? Can there be a design without an object? Can there be design without representation even? And these are sort of the theoretical questions that we're grappling with in these ontological perspectives on design. And he goes on to say how there are so many different ways for designing, in which things are relational brought into life by the authors of design and by designing with other names. So a very important caution for us. And of course, and this is just my little bit about conventional designing. Conventional designing is very much entrapped in the idea of science and technology, in the technological apparatus of the artificial. Now that we can do anything, or what we do, we can design materials, and of course, all the technological imaginary of the moment, from nanotechnology and synthetic biology to artificial intelligence to genetics, which are, in my mind, techno-patriarchal imaginaries, techno-patriarchal capitalist imaginaries, but who are occupying the space for imagining the future. So the question is, who's doing the cultural political work of imagining the future? And I think, to me, this is a very important question. and that we need, from the critical design perspectives, try to challenge these imaginaries, that this is not the only way in which the future will go, and that there are many other future possibles in which we can draw. Okay, Clyde Dale, not probably better than most people I know, is focusing on this, on the idea that how do we design, how does the rise of the artificial as a new horizon for being change the conditions for designing? If human action has always been about artifice, which is true, how this artifice has been entrapped, captured by these ideologies and ontologies of calculation and exploitation and enframing, and how the artificial is bringing into being so many possibilities and so many modes of being, but which again are being trapped, are being colonized, if you wish, or monopolized by the techno-patriarchs of capitalism, global capitalism. And the question then is, how can we still think about biological interdependence as an underlying condition for being before we think about moving to life beyond biology, as the techno gurus would put it? So the question of the artificial and designing within these conditions is very important. Again, I'm going to skip this because my time, I think I have time to tell you a little bit about why I want to go here. Well, let me put the three of them at once, which is, so we are within these new conditions of techno-scientific development and the artificial, and beginning, it's about articulating a vision of the future. If you take something like Bill Gates' new book, there we find a confirmation of the of the ontology of calculation, of the ontology of measurement, of the ontology of science and technology. We don't find there anything new. I'm not saying that some of the things that Gates is saying that we should do are not important. We might have to do some of those things that he says we should do, but that by themselves, not only they won't be enough, but they will entrench, especially destructivism, destruction of the earth, the destruction of the earth that is going on. Because what he calls for is a new combination of science and technology and innovation and business and so forth, that again is going to help with maybe with the reduction of carbon emissions, but it's going to continue the devastation of the earth. I find a very interesting challenge in The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. It's a wonderful science fiction novel. I haven't finished yet the book, but what I've read so far, I think it definitely challenges something like Gates' paradigm. And of course, there's a different kind of challenge in all that indigenous peoples are telling us about climate change and how we can be dealing with that. And again, indigenous peoples are about the rejection and the resistance to terricide and the search for a different way of being, a different paradigm of life, a different civilizational transition. Okay. So in the last 15 minutes or so, in the last part of my lecture, I'd like to talk a little bit about this idea. Is it possible to make design more relational in the sense of relationalizing the making of life? This is going to be mostly from Latin America, but my hope and my hunch is that some of these ideas can be applicable to many parts of the world. It is also something that we've been collecting from the work of many social movements and collectives and struggles against extractive operations, indigenous struggles, peasant struggles, Afro-Colombian, Afro-descendant struggles, and so forth. And it's about designing relationally. So I will draw some implications for designing for each one of these 6 axes, which I'm going to be telling you about in a moment. Some general considerations about the guidelines, which is, and I'm just going to mention the first one because it's part of the work that we've been doing with Terry Winograd, Fernando Flores, Don Norman, most of you know Don, and Scott Rouse. In a small group that we've been meeting for a number of months about how today historical conditions today have changed. The situation that was in the mid-80s when the book Understanding Computers and Cognition, a New Foundation for Design was first written. So we decided that the organizing principle, or sort of a slogan for our group, is that of mobilizing for a new way of dwelling on the earth. And I think this is what is at stake with design in many different ways. Can design become a foundation for a new planetary ethics, for a new way of dwelling on the earth? Okay, so these are the 6 axes. I'm just going to mention them and then explain each of them very briefly. The first one is the recommunalization of social life. Globalization, for the most part, has been the creation, the breakdown, the disruption of everything collective and communal. The second one is the relocalization of activities. Many activities can be relocalized. The third one is the strengthening of autonomy, of local autonomies, collective autonomies. The fourth one is the simultaneous depatriarchalization, deracialization, and decolonization of social relations. The fifth one is the reintegration with the earth, or re-earthing design, re-earthing life, the liberation of Mother Earth, as indigenous peoples in Colombia call it. And the last one is how do we build meshworks among transformative alternatives? And that one I probably won't be able to explain because of lack of time. Okay, very quickly, let me move to through these 6 axes, for each of which we can imagine some design criteria and life projects. The recommunalization of social life. Human experience has been place-based and communal throughout history. In Oaxaca, activists, indigenous intellectuals have coined the concept of communality, or communalitarian condition, the condition of being communal, the condition that says that we exist because everything exists in co-emergence with all living beings under walls. So what we see is a communitarian popular horizon that talks about the possibility for reappropriating the production of life out of, even if the fragments of community, of real existing communities that we still have today, communities that are very much traversed by power, of course, and with all kinds of inequalities within them, but nevertheless with a different ontology of life. So some designing implications: how do we make relationally again? How we make life more relational, communalocratically? How do we think about innovation in a communal manner for designing, for co-designing with communities? I always like Ezio Mancini's idea of SLOC communities, slow, local, open, and connected communities, communities that are local and place-based, but nevertheless, obviously open to conversations worldwide and to struggles worldwide. Very important, I think there has to be a counter-design vis-a-vis the middle-class way of life. At least for the context of Latin America, I see very clearly the middle class in Latin America, in the big cities, live in these, gated communities. It's a very anti-ecological, decommunalizing way of life, and it's offered for most of the rest of Latin America and the world, actually, as the ideal to follow. I think it's an ideal and an imaginary that we have to struggle against in designing. Okay. The second is the relocalization of social, productive, and cultural activities. So we need to relocalize what's possible. There's a lot of emphasis on relocalizing food, for instance, but relocalizing so that we can recover our ability and our autonomy over what we eat, how we learn, how we heal, how we dwell, how to know, because we outsourced those capacities to the agro-industrial food system, to the industrial educational system, and so forth. Okay. Some design implications of this second axis. Elimination design. I mean, there's a lot of, this is from Tony Fry again, there's a lot of designing that has been going on that will have to be eliminated. focus on livelihoods, of course, and the autonomy over livelihood production. Food sovereignty is a very important concept that emerges from Latin American social movements. And to recover, to reconstruct food sovereignty means to reconstruct an entire entanglement, an entire assemblage of relations between seeds and knowledges and the soils and the earth and water and climate and everything else. So it's about reconstituting the web of interrelations that we call food, and to resist, of course, this idea with COVID that we are not going now to be ordering our food and it will be delivered by Amazon.com trucks to our door. Okay, so recentered practices on the autonomous production of life. I think that's the main principle. We can think in terms of designing coalitions for that, communitarian innovation. Two books that are very design friendly for recommunalization and relocalization that I like to recommend. Those of you who don't know it, please take a note. It's a very important and interesting books, and as I say, very design oriented in their own ways. Why autonomy? Because autonomy is the political correlate of recommunalization and relocalization. There cannot be successful recommunalization and relocalization unless there is a degree of autonomy. This is from Southwest Colombia, an indigenous struggle for the liberation of Mother Earth. So autonomy takes place in the context of these ontological struggles and this extractive operation, against the expansion of sugar cane in these particular canes as well. And it's a way to radicalize democracy. It's a way to think in terms of power with. It's a new way of enacting politics with principles of sufficiency, mutuality, conviviality, self-determination. And if we think about some designing implications of making life with a greater degree of autonomy, we can think particularly in terms of some of these guidelines. And for me, and this is what I try to develop in the book, Designs for the Pluriverse, that every design, every community practices the design of itself. Of course, that's not what it happens today for the most part, because again, life is being designed by experts and the state and so forth for people and for communities. But communities, even in that context, have to redesign their conditions of life for themselves. So if we take that as a principle, we come up with very different ideas about designing. And especially about how do we foster non-patriarchal and non-liberal post-capitalist forms of being and living. Okay, so autonomy has to do with interexistence, has to do with relational life making. Fourth one, very, very important, and this is sort of the beginning, the last part of my presentation, has to do with this, with the depatriarchalization of life and of designing. And this comes from Latin American feminisms, all of which emphasize that there cannot be decolonization without depatriarchalization, that patriarchy is an enduring ontology. It's an ontology that privileges control and hierarchy and domination and objectification, and in the last instance, violence and war. And that then we have to build, we have to move from this patriarchal project of things and accumulation and control to a project of relations, a project of relationality. Vincularidad is the term that Argentinian feminist anthropologist Rita Segato coins for this project of relationality. And again, what we can call a feminist and radical relational politics for designing that is based on the reappropriation of the conditions for the production of life under the principles of care and healing and so forth, which is what design, in terms of the designing implications, is about how do we develop designing practices that is based on the principles of care and repairing, wresting away, making life from masculinist capitalist practices. And we can think in terms of enabling ecosystems and design coalitions for this type of communal, feminine, autonomous modes of being that are dysfunctional to capitalism. And I like the concept from Mexican feminists Raquel Gutierrez Aguilar and Rita Segato. They talk about a politics in the feminine. And a politics in the feminine is that politics that is centered on care and repair and the active taking over the power over the production and reproduction of life. It is not an essentialist concept. It is a fully anti-essentialist historical concept in which is basically, maybe I can read this final quote that for me is a good summary of what I'm trying to say here. This is from Rita Segato, who says that if we really want to opt for the relational path, we need to choose the historical project of being community, to oppose the productivist, developmentalist, and exploitative project of things. And she says the strategy from now on is feminine. And again, that sounds like that could be somewhat romantic and essential. Let me assure you, I mean, you have to read, don't take my word for it, but let me assure you to the extent that I can, that is a very sophisticated anti-essentialist post-capitalist statement. That to go back to retrieve the value of the feminine for life making is in many ways the most important historical project that we can engage in today. The fifth axis, very important, of course, is maybe the most important in some sense now, given climate change, is reintegrating with the earth. That designing should really start with earth in mind today. And with the idea that design is about working, it's about world making. In whatever way we understand earth, Gaia, Pachamama, autopoiesis, self-organization, symbiosis, and the fact is that the earth has become a horizon for a renewed process of living, for caring for life, for diverse kinship in the context of global capitalism. And some design implications could be, again, attention to climate change beyond the Anthropocene, beyond the SDGs, beyond sustainability. These are concepts that are compromised because they still belong with the ontology of separation, with the ontology of representation and control, paying attention to the concept of terricide. Sorry. And we have, of course, we have a lot of, in design field, we have precursors for that from Design with Nature and the whole of catalog, designing for sustainability, ecological designing. And today, the emphasis that many people place on the sacred, on the earth and the universe as a living cosmos, the earth as a sacred entity. And so is it possible to think about resacralizing design? And what would that mean? I won't be able to talk here because my time is running out about the very important challenge of urban design. How do we bring this into cities? But maybe we can talk about it in the question and answer period. And I'm going to skip this. I already knew that I didn't have enough time for thinking about this, how the sixth axis, which is how do we connect, how do we build convergences among transformative alternatives? How do we build and foster networks of alternatives? But it is there in the presentation. And basically from this one, only that can design then be seen as part of the struggle over making life, over retrieving the capacity for life making. And what would it mean to design outside of the hegemony of the liberal, secular, rational, modern human? Okay. And finally, a very short conclusion, just a few very quick thoughts. We're all designers and we're all design. So we need to take responsibility for the worlds that we create, anytime, anywhere, especially interrupting the global project of fitting all worlds into one that continues on today. Transition design, relational design, autonomous design as praxis for healing the web of life. Sketch as loop at a time, but always collectively. Design as a mindful and effective pluriverse sustaining, weaving and repairing of the web of life. And design again in terms of mobilizing for a new way of dwelling on the earth. Okay, that's what I had today to present. And let me stop my sharing of the screen and give it back to you, Teresa and Margarida.
Thank you, Arturo, for such an inspiring keynote. You have given us a lot to think about, as usual. We have now time for Q&A. So I will open the mic. I don't know if there are any questions on YouTube. If not, I have one question for you, for sure.
Please.
As a design educator, I am concerned about future generations of designers that graduate every year and that need to be able to recognize complexity and navigate it, and must adopt a non-anthropocentric approach and contribute to the construction of a more than human and sustainable world. But some design schools are very traditional and conventional. Do you think that design schools, and how we can change that, are ready and prepared to reset the curricula and teach the unconventional in a way that future designers can change this web of life and move towards this communalitarian innovation that you were talking about? How can we change that? Because if designers are not taking the lead, it will be hard. And I'm not sure that design, maybe I'm too negative, but I'm not sure that design schools are ready for that. What do you think?
Well, thanks so much, Ana Margarida, for your wonderful question. In a way, that's the most important question that designers can ask themselves or ourselves today. And it's actually a question that is at the heart of what I believe is a relatively large network of people, sorry, which has been spearheaded by Don Norman at UC Santiago. It's a project that is about rethinking design education. And if anybody here in the audience is more familiar with that, yeah, please feel free to speak as well. But that's the question that they are asking themselves. How can we rethink design education to meet these new challenges? Not only the ecological challenge, but also the social challenge, the challenge of increasing social inequality, increasing strife, increasing conflict in the world. And that, as you will say, Ana Margarida, design schools are not training people in that context. So two more ideas maybe. The first one is that I was remembering, as you were asking the question about the Carnegie Mellon School of Design has this sort of new framing for their vision of design that involves 4 different domains. Is from the usual design in terms of product design, object design, then design for services, and then I think it's design for social innovation, and then transition design. But in redesigning, in coming up with that, and this is on, all of it is on their website, in coming up with that rethinking, they also came to the realization that they needed to introduce a new way of thinking about social complexity and social change for designers. So by producing what they call a new mindset for designers, they have to first come up with a new theory, a new understanding of social complexity and social change that is ecological, that is social, that is political. So I think there is something there to be looked into. And I think second, I think complexity is a key concept there. That that designers have to be trained in at least some of the basic elements of this complexity, and that has to do with some ecological training, some social theory training, some cultural theory training, a little bit of philosophy. And philosophy is fine. I mean, understanding and studying philosophy is not that hard. I mean, it's supposed to be hard, but it is actually not. But if we design that curricula with that complexity for designers. And in the context of this kind of arising or emerging ontological perspectives on design, I think it will make more sense in terms of new modules for design education. The last part may be incorporating, I always find the power of stories, storytelling and stories and fiction in designing, because it goes beyond the mere theoretical understanding. I think theoretical understanding is very limited. I'm seeing it more and more, that, I mean, we cannot theorize our way out of this crisis. And the limits of theory, of social theory in particular, because of the very same fact that social theory are logocentric, meaning by that they are centered on the logos, they are centered on the abstraction. They abstract from reality. So they leave out so many aspects of reality that are important for designers, that we need to try to find ways to incorporate those aspects, and maybe a storytelling, different kinds of narratives can be important in that regard. The resetting the curriculum, I think, yeah, there's a default curriculum. And again, I think that's a very important project for all designers today, or design schools today.
Thank you, Arturo. We have also a question from Maria Cristina Ibarra that she asks, Arturo, what do you think about the concept of sustainability? Sometimes it seems that it's something that industry uses for selling more.
Yes, I think Maria Cristina is absolutely right. I think the concept of sustainability is one of those concepts that emerged with great hope in the late 80s, and that very quickly became clear that the sustainability referred to the sustainment, to sustaining a particular mode of being, that it wouldn't stray too far away from that capitalistic, technoscientific mode of being. And so most ideas about sustainability today, like Bill Gates, I mean, Bill Gates you can say, is an attempt to have a sustainable world, but it won't make it, because it's still, sustainability is not just about science and technology. Sustainability is about what needs to be sustained. The last instance is life itself, and how to sustain life if everything that we do is going against that. So sustainability, sustaining life, which is different than sustainability, demands from us a completely different understanding of design and of what needs to be done. There are very good ideas in the field of ecological design, but still I think they have to be radicalized and deepened more. They have to be pushed towards questioning the philosophical principles of this monocultural idea of the human in which we are trapped, that we mentioned as liberal, secular, the human that is based on private property and individuals and rights and so forth. So how do we go beyond that? I think it's going to be very important. Tony Fried says that the world today is embedded in structural unsustainability, and that we need to move towards what he calls sustainment, going through unsustainability, but to emerge at this thing called sustainment. But the sustainment requires of a very significant or radical change, similar to that the West underwent with the Enlightenment. So from Enlightenment to sustainment, there has to be a very significant civilizational transformation that is not going to be achieved by any notion of sustainability as we know them today.
Well, I think we have space for another question, and this one comes from Antonio Gorgel Pinto, asking you how to make clear that this idea of common is not another version of communism.
Okay. If Antonio refers to commons, or there there are commons, commoning, there are communality, there are this commonism. Some people have coined the concept not communism, but commonism, like commonsism, meaning by that a strategy that is based on the rebuilding of the commons. So, and again, let me emphasize the book Free, Fair and Alive by David Bollier and Silke Helfrich, which deals with these kinds of issues. And they say, no, it's not about communism in the sense, it is much more than going beyond property, beyond social relations of production. It is going beyond political systems. It is about a profound transformation. So the degrowth movement, for instance, in Europe, and the commons and commoning movement are oriented in that sense. They are more, if anything, I would say, the inspiration is anarchistic in the good sense of the term. I mean, anarchism is a philosophical position, just like liberalism or communism or Marxism. It's a philosophical position and practice that emphasizes local autonomies over autonomies, at the regional, national, global levels, local autonomies and the confederation of these locally autonomous units into larger entities. That comes also from the field of social ecology, Murray Bookchin. Some of those principles are, in some ways, you can find, like in Zapatista communities, in the Rojava feminist struggle in Kurdistan. So it is about commons and commoning, and about recuperating the capacity, again, to think about what life is in a different way, to recovering the capacity to produce life more autonomously at the local level, to defend from the enclosure by private property, to defend those lands from dispossession and pillage by corporations. All of that is what commoning is bringing about. So certainly you can say there is a socialist praxis in commoning, but more than a socialist praxis, maybe an anarchist praxis. But more than that, I think there's a praxis of living, a different practice of living, a practice of living as an active regaining of the conditions for the production of life, of making life.
Thank you. And just the last question from Jack. How should we promote the public consciousness to empathize with non-human beings? Sometimes we are even not kind enough to animals.
Yes, that's very well said. And that's a very tough question, because we have, centuries of these anthropocentric, death-centered social systems. And cities, the experience of cities, unfortunately, have consolidated that anthropocentric, anti-life ethos and way of being. And why do I say that about cities? Because cities in a way have been built historically, at least it's the Greek polis, the Greek cities, built on two anomalies. The first anomaly is that cities were built at the expense of nature, didn't incorporate nature, and hence the need for re-earthing cities, bringing nature back into the cities. And second, cities were also built against peasants. Peasants were outside the cities, outside the walls of the cities. And peasants are the ones who have carried on, indigenous peoples, carried on the way of being in connection with non-human living beings. But I find it very encouraging with young people in particular. Young people are much more attuned today to these questions about the non-human. Not only in theory, but in practice. I mean, the practice of young people today, you find much more people interested in gardening, interested in animal rights, interested in even in their daily life, having a different ethics in relation to animals, finding an animal on the street and trying to do something about it. So I think there is an emerging ethics, because what is emerging today with greatest force, and I will end with this, worldwide, is Earth itself. The Earth is affirming its presence to us if we know how to listen to it, not only because of catastrophic climate change, I mean, that's part of it, but also because everything we do today, I mean, COVID, what was COVID if not a reassessment of the Earth in many ways? Again, the consciousness in the rupture promoted, made possible by COVID, and that rupture, in that space that emerged, that is being recolonized already, unfortunately, too quickly by business as usual, that in that opening, that people began to reconnect with the natural world. And I think that's a very important question.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Arturo. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
We will have now our three panel speakers in a row, and at the end we will have time for Q&A. Again, I will introduce our first speaker, Paolo Cascone. He's an architect born in Italy and grew up between West Indies and East Africa. Paolo has a PhD at the intersection of environmental engineering and sustainable architecture. He is the founding director of Co-Design Lab and teaches architecture and environmental design at University of Westminster, and is the scientific director of the African Fibers Project. His work on ecological design and performative architecture has been exhibited and published widely. The African Fibers Project is currently displayed at the Italian Pavilion of the Venice Biennale of Architecture. So we are eager to hear Paolo on decolonizing performative design. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's an honor to be part of such a very interesting panel. I will start to share the screen just to use, I hope you can see my screen now, to use this video from the African Fiber Project just to explain you.
We are not seeing your screen. You didn't start.
Just a second.
Okay. Okay.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So what I will try to summarize in these 15 minutes, I will try to be fast and furious, is, let's say, the rationale which is behind the African Fiber Project, and this idea of actually rethinking the teaching of architecture and environmental design, trying to bridging advanced technologies and informal cultures. Of course, the African Fiber Project is a paradigmatic project developed within a sort of research by practice approach. And the project has been for many years a sort of an academic school, an academic school of architecture and ecological design in between different countries around Africa, mainly sub-Saharan Africa. The project has been independently developed with this idea of reconsidering the possibility of working in, at the intersection of advanced design, digital manufacturing, and traditional crafting, with this idea of actually establishing a relationship in between local and informal culture and performative design. Of course, this is a very long path that we have been developing with this idea of considering the opportunity of decolonizing the teaching of architecture and design with the aim of somehow involving not just indigenous communities, but also European students and researchers in these projects. I strongly believe in this very controversial aspect. I think that decolonization is a process, a collective process that is involving people from different backgrounds. It's not just an African issue or a Black Lives issue. I know this is very popular topic and very delicate, but I have to say, as a Neapolitan, I grew up in between Africa and Europe, that probably this is not really just an issue of again leave African people alone with their problems. On the other hand, I don't think that the humanitarian response is a part of our project. In the contrary, the project is really trying to develop a new cultural platform within a sort of learning by doing approach. This learning by doing approach is related to this idea to, first of all, try to uh, reconsider the relation between architects, designer, and local communities. And secondly, starting to understand how to develop uh, collaborative project in the public space by again speculating on this idea of local industry. This idea of local industry, I think, is very important for the next generation of architects and designers, connecting production and design together, developing making by design methodology is very, very important. Uh, so the question is really related to trying to reconsider the relation between climatic issues and material system. And this is probably one of the first aspects that we might need to discuss how we can actually work in osmosis with the landscape, how we could actually develop a sort of a non-extractive approach, uh, and how this is somehow affecting the way we are developing dwellings and artifacts. And again, learning from informality, which is one of the aspects of possible decolonization of the discipline, learning from the complexity of informal architecture and informal settlements is really related to the so-called question of emergent technologies. How this complexity, this redundancy, this kind of transcalarity is functional to a new idea of society, which is coming from the pre-colonial culture, and how the digital discipline could somehow generate a new, let's say, synthetic vernacular approach. So I don't see any dichotomy between the question of advanced technology and community-oriented project. I see more an opportunity to involve the local community into a way to somehow control technology and use technology according to specific needs. And again, this is a very transdisciplinary approach that I'm proposing here today, which is really based on this idea of also starting from tools. Tools are quite important in our work. In this video, you actually are looking at this work, which was starting collaboration with Fabrizio Carola, which was an Italian architect and Agata Khan Award architect, is collaborating with in Mali, which was actually evolving a Nubian compass, which is somehow the grandfather of a robotic arm. So again, we need to think in evolutionary way. We need to think technology as a way to actually evolve uh, uh, in a clever way the possibility of optimizing resources. So this question of connecting analog tools within digital tools is one of the opportunity to rethink the question of local industry. Shaping, transforming, assembling material with this approach seems to me one of the possibility to somehow transform the technology in a more affordable opportunity for disadvantaged communities. But again, what is very important is this relation between climatic issues and local and let's say the strategic use of local materials. Without any rhetoric, I think that this is a creative opportunity. This is an opportunity to actually establish a relationship between nature and techne. Uh, and this relationship is really related to the possibility of working with a sort of kilometer zero approach, in which actually the question of uh, um, working with what is available on site is somehow again is a creative driver. There's a creative driver to generate families of solutions, and these families of solutions are quite similar to what is happening in pre-colonial culture. Actually, with this kind of what we call informal and implicit algorithms. And so again, I would love to discuss this with Arturo as well. I don't see any problem with algorithms. Algorithms are belonging to pre-colonial architecture. They were implicit, and what is interesting now is trying to understand how we could work in an explicit way with algorithms in order to transform them in a more sustainable and affordable solution for local communities. The question of actually complexity again is really the relation between geometry, material system, climatic issues, but I would say especially anthropological aspects. So how geometry is somehow creating this mediation in between these different aspects and variables. Uh, Again, what is interesting in this kind of challenge we were dealing with the African Public School, you are looking at different projects developing over the year, where most of them they were like a small workshop involving local communities and students of design and also artisans from many places around Africa, and between Morocco, Mali, Burkina Faso, uh, Cameroon, and Senegal. So what is changing here is the role of materials, materiality, the, the, the question of somehow speculating on local techniques, and at the same time trying to create this kind of very transversal community of makers, transforming actually their own public space in a more playful and sometimes useful space for relational activities. So at the same time, in our experience in African Fabric Project, we're trying to speculate on this question of transforming material, learning from this question of, again, building and producing solution transforming earth, for example, in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Morocco. We're starting to rethink the question of, for example, digital fabrication. And so what we tried to do strategically, we were actually interested to transform uh, artisan space into independent fabrication laboratories. And these fabrication laboratories were starting to transform local materials to in order to use it for 3D printing, for example. What is interesting in this speculation is the possibility to actually, first of all, develop local 3D printers and local technology with a very low cost approach. And the second way, the issue is actually related to the possibility to, again, work on another alternative possibility of tailor-made production, alternative to the mass production. So uh, the production which is on demand and which is somehow is related to the use of natural materials uh, um, and let's say self-produced technology. I strongly believe that the question of starting from self-produced your own tool, your own technology, is strategically very interesting and very important, not just for students, but also for young practitioners and the new generation of designers. I think that this is probably one of the most subversive way in order to work on a sort of an ecological shift. And this is really related to the question of hacking technology. Hacking is one of the main word of our vocabulary. Is hacking is about reconstructing and transforming existing technology and existing object in something different, something new, and something more open and more affordable. What is important in our work in the African Fiber Project is really this question of uh, somehow working with complexity and at the same time connecting the digital culture and the question of advanced culture with a very low tech approach. And the question of creating this transversal platform, creating a connection between south-south communities, because again, Africa is a continent, and our projects are sometimes uh, um, involving African students from different regions, and this is very rich and very diverse. But it's also creating something which is not very usual. It's giving the possibility to African students and European students, and sometimes American students, to work together and share knowledge. This question of sharing knowledge is, I think, one of the most important aspects. I think that this question of decolonizing um, architectural and design education is somehow something that needs to connect people from different backgrounds. It's not coming from one direction, but is a way to merge actually different perspective and this and different know-how. So what is now the African Fiber platform is somehow a constellation of projects that are also educational, but at the same time a research project. And one of the most important part of our work in the last 5 years was mainly based in Cameroon, in Douala, where we had the chance to basically develop a sort of more permanent laboratory of the African fibers, thanks to a project financed by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in connection with the local ONG partners such Camon and the Laba School of Fine Arts of Douala. So we were basically starting from zero. This is the first images from our laboratory, and we start to map actually the different artisan around our site and trying to involve them in the self-construction of the laboratory. And this was strategically very important, the way of somehow trying to create a sort of self-responsibility in creating not just a piece of design or a piece of architecture, but the laboratory itself, a common ground, a place, a sort of mm, um, community-oriented design gym more than a science laboratory. Gym is a way, it's a place where people can train itself and can also somehow uh, make experiments and fail. So the African Fabric School in Cameroon start with this idea of connecting the local materials with the digital fabrication tools and connecting local artisans and makers from different places around Africa and Europe. And this kind of these students in the last 3 years were somehow um, involving the local community in micro uh, um, architectural micro urban infrastructure that were somehow the first step of something a little bit bigger, which was the building itself of a cultural hub. This cultural hub of Douala was somehow uh, co-designed by a group of students, professor, African professor of fine art, and local artisan, with this idea of have a sort of uh, place where people could somehow interact on different disciplines in between fine arts, design, and self-construction. And the school itself has also, the cultural lab itself has also a co-working and place for uh, transforming local material like such clay and wood. We have to say that Cameroon is one of the biggest exporter of wood in the world, mainly for the design industry, European design industry. And the idea of this laboratory is to start to think how to transform material on site and how to train local students and local artists into this way of creating a sort of new synthetic vernacular design connecting digital and traditional techniques. So the whole journey of this African fabric experience in Cameroon was to mainly using a learning by doing methodology to train the people and to at the same times also learning from them on how to rethink the question of self-construction for housing project, but also for the construction of the cultural hub. So this relationship in between, again, analog and digital culture were generating the first prototype of the African Fiber House, which is a low cost and affordable off-grid housing project that we are keep developing with the local community in order to create possible variation that could potentially be used and transformed by the local community. And the very, very last images I want to show you are related to the cultural hub itself, which is almost finished. And yeah, this is the project, and the project now is being uh, realized. Can you hear me? Uh, so this is the final images of the cultural hub that we got designed with the local association and the local students, where the students were mainly involved in the facade system and part of the construction system. And again, I hope will be a project that could potentially become a starting point for a new way to connect European and African students and of fine art and design and architecture in the next decades. And that this is a very unique project because again, has, is somehow connecting different places around Cameroon, different places around sub-Saharan Africa, but is also trying to connect European institution, educational institution, and African institution. So this is my presentation today, and I would love to discuss these and other issues with you in the next discussion. So thanks everyone, and I will now stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Paolo. We will proceed right away with our second speaker, Yanki Lee. Yanki Lee research and teach between Hong Kong, London, and Vexio. As a design activist with architectural design background and founder of Enable Foundation, a social design collective and an education charity, Yanki co-design objects and exhibition as co-creative tools that unlock wicked social problems using immersed design methodologies. As a design researcher, Yanki Lee started her career on self-reflective discussions about human-centered design, practice, and now the discussion is extended from human to non-human. Yanki Lee is also known for her work on topics such as aging and dementia, as well in collaborative processes for social innovation. We are excited to hear your talk from older people to butterflies, design as the others. The floor is yours, Yanki.
Thank you, Teresa. I'm trying my best to really quickly just put up some points that I prepared for everyone. Thanks for the invitation, and especially in this really interesting panel. And what I find is even more interesting is these are like hanging, like dangling, like questions at the end. It's like from human-centered to life-centered design and beyond. And I hope I will share my experience over the 20 years time, how this transformation can happen and what will be the next step that we want to take forward. So the presentation or my sharing started in 1979, which is like I'm a few years old. But I think it's really important that where human-centered design started, when Professor Patricia Moore, who was only 26 years old, very fresh product designers working in New York. And she's been giving this brief that design for those people. And I think what they mean by those people at that time is about the older people that never been addressed by design. So this is where they're starting from human-centered design, universal design, design for all, which is a very strong movement of human rights from the North America, and then also in Scandinavia and also in Japan, and all happening. But my experience is also very relevant to Patty, which is really important of my mentor. In 20 years later, where I moved from Hong Kong to London and start my master in architecture, and where I met Professor Roger Coleman, who is the founder of inclusive design in the UK, especially in London, talking about user center. So changing from human to much more about user, the people there. And so, but Roger really looking at is not just about who are the users, but he really talking about in 1994, he actually urged all the designers to design inclusively and design for social inclusion, and thinking about questioning who those being excluded by design. And really my pleasure and honor to work with him over like 20 years time, and together we've been writing papers and looking at designers. I think this is back to the discussion of what is the role of designer and design education, design school, and we were really trying to push this agenda, designer as an enabler to use design as a social tools to make social change. And this is why I start Enable Foundation 4 years ago, which is, I think is also a response to being at design school, researching, teaching for many years. And it's a moment of reflection that maybe we should move on and not working in the design institutes or traditional institutions. And how can we do it in a different way? So we're looking for transformation of design professional. And so from architecture, myself, from different from design 1.0 in architecture design, traditional design, to really being part of the inclusive design movement, but more moving into this organization and design thinking mode to making organization change, transformational change. But I think together here, I think we all care about is what design can be designed for social innovation and making a societal and even the planet can be making into part of this agenda. So since then, my work has been really focusing on the new roles of design and thinking about this of democratic innovation, what will be we can do as a design, is a professional field. So what I've been looking at is like democratizing design. So instead of just teaching design in design school, become very traditional vocational training, we're training a designer, but actually we're bringing design to the society, to the community, teaching people to design with us, design together with the professional. But I think it's by setting up a charity and also an education collective, which is really making this happen, that working across different sector and different age group. So our strapline is designed by people for people. And I would imagine a lot of you may like, oh, sounds so cliche, familiar. But I think what we've been looking at is traditionally we always talking about design for people. But from my experience in a lot of design school, the people is not there. It's all about design. So design for people is still a long way to go from 1950. So what we've been doing as a very reflective group of researchers, we're talking about other way, but then still it's a long way to go. So for example, I start with 1979 when Patty did that experiment, and that inspired a whole commercial setting about the aging suit, which is, I have really a lot of question about, is this still ethical? After so many years, have been so popular in education, in training, and also design thinking, like experimentation. So my question is, can we move on? So what we've been doing is, instead of like doing this of like, I would say spoon feeding training to design student or even to a CEO of a company, we actually asking everyone to our workshop to design their immersive tools. So it's asking themselves, what I really care about the older people. How can I immerse and transform my body to be an aging body? So instead of like giving you a tools to experience aging, you thinking about aging yourself and design something for yourself, transforming and immerse yourself into the situation. So what we've been doing in Hong Kong is working on different topics. So one of the bigger topic is aging innovation, which is we've been working with Social Innovation Fund in Hong Kong and looking at like death, dementia, and productive aging, is trying to turn around aging as a positive resources for the society rather than a burden. So we're working with a lot of cross-disciplinary, looking at different generations. So when medical experts talk about end of life or good death, we're talking about fine dying. So designers have a new role to designing death culture, which is also designing objects. I love the ideas that we're not designing projects, but how can we, some objects, artifacts that which is art designers been trained to do, to actually become tools for citizens to design their own green burial and better grieving. How can I talk about aging bodies like medicals, treatment, age-friendly city, but designer, we can do something different, that we launch something called the old school, which is something called designing age culture, making this old school for all generations to learn about aging together. So it's not just about the older people or care about the aging population, but it's actually all of us learn about aging as a positive future. But more important, we've been doing a lot of work on dementia, which is we work a lot with medical experts, but we are not the one designing the treatment. And also we're also part of this campaign about design dementia-friendly city. But as we do, we always have this trigger and new, more disruptive concept. So we call the dementia land, which is imaginative cities that actually everyone have dementia. So how can we design tools to enable citizens to actually co-create this dementia-friendly to freely community that actually opening up a new paradigms for actually including people with dementia into our society. So what we've been doing, we've been making a lot of tools. So this is some of the tools that we work with the dementia project, which is about dementia metaphor, map of objects, which is really bridging the design community and creativity into everyday life, and also especially to our social service sectors, because they are the one holding all the resources, delivering direct service to help those who need help. So what we've been looking at is this, I think also for today, I really want to leave this message and thinking for everyone is I actually changed this. Actually, I really like the way we're designing. So I think this is really clear my thinking, because I always as a designer, I think I always see design as a verb, but I think if you work in public sector, like general public businessmen, they also design as artifacts. This is what the problem is. I think this is really a good way to say designing. So, but then what I bring into the discussion is how can we design as the other? So rather than design for people, we're actually asking everyone design as the other. So it's two changes. So it's as, so we actually immerse ourselves, become the others. And also it's not just people, but others. But then that bring into this 2030 agenda of like the sustainable development goal is no one is left behind. But I think for designer, very pragmatic, we want to know how we can do this. So what we did is we go out to define the others. So who are we before we define the others? Are we young? Who are we? Are we just able-bodied? Who are we? Are we just white without any colors? Who are we? Are we just human or actually non-human? So I think for us, it's really about defining ourselves, which is about internalization, but at the same time to really defining who are the others, that how can we develop this relationship between ourselves and the others. And so for me, I've been working on aging for many years. I think for the others is really about the older people, but I'm interested in alternative way to thinking about aging and also bringing older people as part of my research and partners. And then looking at how they live in the society, how they actually design in their own home, how they actually designing future services with young people and challenging policy, how we can actually work with them, and especially in dementia, the carers, those who taking care of people with dementia, to visualizing dementia through different ways of doing it. So I should show you this very quick video. So what we did is we actually used design skills, design action. We make tools to make public to understand dementia by immersing themselves into the situation of dementia, but also as a carers and also as a general public to really making this awareness, like really bringing to everyday conversation. And we're also making objects that this is an object that we launched and produced called the envelope, which is a new one-off ashes dispenser for garden burial, enabling citizens to design their own garden burial ceremony. So what we did is that we constantly going out to society, we co-create showcases, not traditional exhibition, but it's really an immersive experience for everyone to share our finding, to share the things that we find from design by people for themselves, and then turn it to education tools to engaging everyone in the society, talk about topic like dementia, dying, something that we don't talk every day. So what Enable Foundation is really looking at is like changing from design thinking to design with as the others, but looking at these 5 stages of investigation, which is about research, immersive, and also idealization, intervention, and more important, leaving the academics behind. I came to really want to implement ideas with citizens. So we're designing co-creation, cross-generational, cross-disciplinary, and cross-thinking culture through design. But what I will leave to you guys is like, I think some people know my work or been hearing I'm talking. I've been working on aging for 20 years. And it's always in my heart, what next? So the others for me is very obvious, is the multi-species, is what we as human beings related to the dog, to the bird, how can we immerse to other species, but design from their perspective. And then, but also the interesting thing is how can we understand them and design these tools for ourselves, for our student, for our collaborator to immerse to the other species, which is something very exciting. And the outcome will be fascinating. Like some of my students, 2 weeks in Hong Kong from Zurich, designed this, the wind capturer, which is something we say the wind is saying hello to us, is how can we capture where the air flow, and how can we pay more attention to our nature. So I think designers have a lot of role to play in this very big issues which is a more social responsibility of our professional. And so together we're looking at new tactics to looking at this of like, for example, we'll talk about angry species encyclopedia. How can we develop this become design that actually benefiting the whole discussion of non-human centered design? So yeah, from all the people, I'm moving on with developing big project about the critical ecologies, like other species and the otherness. So this is what I want to leave it to you guys. And then hopefully we can cross our paths and then starting to bring this new practice together. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanki Lee. Last but not least, let me introduce our last speaker, Martin Ávila. Martin is a designer, researcher and professor of design at Konstfack, the University of Arts, Crafts and Design in Stockholm, Sweden. His PhD work devices on hospitality, hostility and design was awarded the 2012 Prize for Design Research by the Swedish Faculty for Design Research and Research Education. His postdoctoral project, Symbiotic Tactics, has been the first of its kind to be financed by the Swedish Research Council. Martin's research is design-driven and addresses forms of interspecies cohabitation. So let's hear Martin on alternatives, designing as a poetics of relating. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me start by sharing screen. Do you see my first slide there?
Yes.
Great. So, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to join this event. It's an honor and a very interesting panel, really exciting. At the moment, I'm working on a book where I developed the notion of alternatives, which I will explain soon. And there I'm using the projects of different people to give examples, but today we have little time, so I'll be presenting only one of my own projects to give you a sense of what I'm arguing about through this concept. I will not be able either to unpack all these words in this short presentation. So to enter the theme of our session, I will use the word diverse or diversity. And through this word, suggest some of what I believe is at stake in the words of the title of our session. The project that I will present was developed in Argentina. And if we start by thinking of diversity as biodiversity, it is useful to visit this website, at least as a reference, the site of the Convention on Biological Diversity. I actually recommend you all to check the country that you're in to get a sense of this dimension that keeps us alive. If I zoom into that paragraph that describes the country, it says the Republic of Argentina is classified as one of the world's mega diverse countries. Argentina boasts some of the best varieties of ecosystems in the world, 15 continental zones, 3 oceanic zones, and the Antarctic region, all represented in its territory. This is, in my view, great wealth, and to care for it brings great responsibility as well. I would say that partly to think diversity, to value these differences, difference as value in itself, diversity becomes positive in this sense. This is a map of some of the ecoregions of Argentina. These are the 3 ecoregions that correspond to the province of Córdoba, where I was working. But if we look at other cartographies, it shows that these ecoregions are not as definite nor as pure as in the other map. There are natural artificial hybrids, there are continuums in that sense. So we really need to think of them as a continuum and use words such as agroecosystems, urban ecologies, nature cultures, and so on and so forth. And what's important for me here is to understand that for humans, it is natural to produce the artificial. There's no paradox, there's no dichotomy there. We cannot think the artificial or natural as absolute categories. These are always relative to each other. So, but what must be questioned is in what way the artificial participates in and with life cycles. And here we understand that the dominant global design culture that we have created interrupts the life cycles of most beings. So in this context, I designed the project that I will show. It's a proposal of an artifact that connects, or tries to connect some humans to vital cycles of a few other than human beings. Spicy Species was the working title of one of the projects that I did during postdoctoral research a few years ago. And the design was made in collaboration with my friend, colleague, Leonardo Lopez. The initial starting point was the intimate relationship we established with plants because we feed on them. By ingesting them, they affect us through the chemistry and the nutritional and medicinal properties. So the design proposal is based on knowledge from different people, scientists, and also those that practice alternative medicine in this region. At the same time, knowledge of and by the bees that are the main pollinators of the plant that we work with. So with the guidance of researchers at the Multidisciplinary Institute of Vegetal Biology in Córdoba, we studied 4 native floral plants of that region, all of them medicinal and some of them medicinal and edible. And it is common in this region that companies sell dry parts of different plants to be used in infusions for different medicinal purposes. But the habitats of these plants are decreasing everywhere in the country, and only 3 to 5% of the native forests remain. Everything else is being used for different forms of urbanization or agriculture. If we would be concentrated in one single place, the yellow part would be approximately 5% of that region. So with the decrease of native forest, there is a decrease of species, but also of a variety of cultural knowledge of those species. In this way, cultural diversity connects with biodiversity very strongly. We chose in the end of the 4 native plants so we were studying, we chose to work with the passion flower. The scientific name is Passiflora caerulea, for being both medicinal and edible. And for some specific interactions they have with carpenter bees that make them vulnerable in the urban context of the city of Córdoba. This is the way one finds the plant in the native forests or in the fields, the climbing plants, the bushes, or the use of the other plants to expand, basically. These plants are chosen not only as ornamental plants for the beauty, but also and especially as medicinal plants, as I mentioned. One can make decoctions, infusions, or tinctures that have a really relaxing effect. They're anti-stress for humans. There are many visitors that this plant has. We have paid special attention to its main pollinator. A carpenter bee is the one that looks like a bumblebee in this figure, called Psilocopa. And bee and plant have co-evolved so that their morphologies, the form, are complementary to each other. The flowers have 5 stamens that expose the pollen down. You can see in the picture, the bees then seeks the nectar at the center of the flower and rubs it back against the stamens with pollen, loading pollen and then disseminated from flower to flower, enabling the reproduction of the plant, as we know. They also, quite big and very powerful, so they actually vibrate and shake, producing something called buzz pollination. They're very effective at sort of embedding themselves with pollen, so very effective pollinators. In any case, they're polylactic, so that means that they feed and visit a variety of plants, but they prefer the passion flower because they have more nectar. There are 18 species of Psilocopa in Argentina. This nest in dry wood by drilling holes to lay eggs and protect the young. And of those found in Córdoba, we decided to work with 2 species, Psilocopa artifex and Psilocopa ciliata. And the peculiarity of these 2 is that they drill not on solid wood, but on hollow woods like cane or eryngium. Cane is what you see on the left, eryngium is on the right. And we decided to work with 2 species in particular because both are increasingly rare in urban areas. They're more threatened by human preferences for other plants. What you see here is a cut of a cane with the larvae of these bees. And we saw that from the scrapping of the walls, the partitions, as you can see there, where they put eggs inside the cane, or the ring for the matter. And the larvae then grow, and once develop as carpenter bees, the mother brings them food until they're independent enough, or strong, I mean, big enough to be independent. We did experiments to create what we call a cycle initiator. And we work with soft materials of different kind. We actually failed on many experiments to work to produce our own materials with softwoods from the regions, but we experimented a lot as well with MDF, which is the sample that you see here. And here we see that Psilocopas has gnawed and accepted the MDF. They need the sawdust for the separation, remember. So you see the traces of the MDF there and the entry, and also traces of pollen. So in any case, this is our proposal, what we call a cycle initiator. It is made of 3 cylindrical compartments, 1 solid peg, and then a flask that contains 2 plant germinators. And the set several possibilities to grow the flora plants, to contribute to the habitat of the Psilocopas of this species, and then to others that visit them, and to encourage its use as a medicinal plant. I won't go too much into detail of the thing itself. These are some of the details of the artifact. Here at the top part, it is possible to see the inside the flask, the germinators that I will show you in a minute. And this is a set that is meant to work, that is meant to be planted anywhere in a garden, but also in a imagine someone being in a balcony and making a pot to actually plant this plant. Then the soil is prepared to make a pot. The package is disassembled. The compartments are inserted into one another. Seals are fastened and tightened. The construction at the prescribed heights that we put, it's planted on the soil. Then the germinators are removed from the flask and they're planted. And here you can see the seeds of the passion flower in the germinator. And the germinators are made of vermiculite and clay. And so when this is watered, then vermiculite and clay dissolve, making possible the germination by letting the soil nutrients come in. One waits about a month until it starts to grow, and then it does. And when it starts to grow, the tendrils of the plant use the seals to climb. Remember that this is a climbing plant. So these seals were first used to pack the parts and are now used to make the plants tangle up. When the plant has matured and exceeded the height of the initiator, it can be pruned. And through this set, we suggest that people prepare tinctures, which are made from the leaves and stems taken from this pruning. And I will actually skip the explaining of the process itself, but I can say that after 4 to 8 weeks, then leaves and stems are filtered and the tincture is removed. And fresh parts concentrate more the chemical properties of the plant and give a lighter color to the tincture, which is what you see, the difference that you see here. The tincture is put into the dosing tube that comes with our set. And then the tincture, like infusions, have a relaxing effect, as I mentioned, which is anti-stress. But unlike infusions, tincture are better at concentrating the chemicals of the plant, and this is why we recommend it and sort of prescribe it in this way. Ideally, this is what we would see after a while. So what must be understood is that this is becoming more difficult to happen naturally because in the city, there's a lack of that plants that the pollinators inhabit. Hence the need to create, to relate to these native plants in a way that also includes the pollinators. And here comes, where I'm sort of thinking somehow. At the moment, I'm working on a concept that can help me to think artifact relations to the living. I just gave you an example of one of my own projects. There are many ones that I could speak about, but alternatives is a wordplay with alternatives. Of course, And this is the notion that I'm trying to create, of an alternative. And for me, an alternative is something that indicates the alterity of a thing, its own foreigners to environments by being artificial, fabricated by humans. An alternative demands thinking how something alters the relations to those that live in an environment, how it makes them different in some way. It suggests the possibility that these others may enter a process of nativization, if they're designed with the ecological and biological constraints of the particular places where they will be used. And here there's something important. By highlighting the word native with a hyphen, as I'm doing, I'm not suggesting a binary, a simplified opposition native alien. What I'm after is paying attention to how something participates in the processes on which living creatures depend upon. Then finally, the notion of alternative does not explain anything, it does not explicate. It demands answer. The implication needs to be unfolded, traced, maintained. Alternatives emphasizes vulnerability in order to become life-affirming. This is what I'm after here. So using this conceptual frame, could we ask, how is this an alternative, the project that I just presented you? Does this artifact, as alterity, as another, participate in the life of native species or those that live in these regions? I would say to some extent. There is a psychological dimension. It brings us emotionally closer to other than human native species in this case. There's a social human dimension. We can ask whose knowledge is being sort of prescribed or composed, materialized through this piece. Those of scientists, but also of people that practice traditional medicine, which is non-allopathic, and have first-hand knowledge of the plants and the visitors. There is an environmental dimension. The set makes possible the presence of pollinators and plants, and also materializes knowledge, takes them into account. The plant that climbs the bee, the 6 cavities in tubular structures, and so on. This is, for example, the way Silocopa recognizes the cane, going around to assess the suitability of the cane for a nest. But when I asked biologists to explain what exactly was the bee doing, they were actually not certain. We said we still know too little about this process of recognition. For example, the bee taps on the surface of the cane occasionally, but it is not known what kind of information it's retrieving. So our proposal has cylindrical components so that the bees can recognize the patterns of cylindrical structures and match part of the nature cultures they navigate. Yet we cannot say with certainty to what extent or to what degree this can be an alternative, in the sense that I'm thinking to the habits they have. This is almost my last slide. This is my website. You will find these and other projects here, including some publications. But I wanted to leave you with this quote from the Martinican poet Edouard Glissant. He says, "Relation is a knowledge in motion of beings, which risk the beings of the world." I love this quote, and since I call this presentation Alternatives, Designing as a Poetics of Relating, I wanted to elaborate a bit on this. For me, a poetics of relating through design implies this risking, the risk to embody knowledge, incapable or capable of communicating with the many others that enliven this planet. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Martin. So it was really inspiring to hear you all. I will open the discussion and start the Q&A. I'm just checking if there are any questions on our YouTube chat. If not, we have here one question. So for the three of you, you can choose which one will answer. So what are the main barriers, based on your experience, to the intended paradigm shift Paolo had the support of the Italian government, Martin had an award from the Swedish Research Council, and Yanki had also the support from the UK institutions. So this shows that there is the recognition of the need for this paradigm shift, but it was easy to convince them. Did you struggle, or did you use storytelling in such a way that convinced decision makers to support your projects? Which one of you?
Yanki, go ahead, please.
Okay. I think this is why we thought about ourselves and the others, because, for example, recently been looking at this critical ecologies project, and the funder will ask why we only funding project which is benefit to the butterfly but not to human being. So I mean, it's really interesting. So we thought this is an education program that we immerse young people to immerse to different species, insects in the city, and then we will do something at the social innovation project. But at the end, funder really care is about, is it still benefiting human being? And so I think what we experience is to really learn about this language, to talk to different people, how we can actually make it the impact. So it's not about holding on something that you truly believe, but I think you know what you want to do at the end. But then I think there's a long way to really learning different language, like big charity funds, government department. So if you're talking to social welfare department, they know what we're doing about aging. But then the environmental department would never know why we're doing project with older people, but actually care about the ecologists. So I think it's all this like port between different professional, and I think we need to have this language shift to really persuade people. But I think it's also a challenge and also a very interesting design exercise for us.
Paolo, Martin?
Can I say something?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, very, very quickly. I think the question is always, I mean, from my experience, is always is not getting the money or the support for implementing something. It's more trying to develop something that stand on their own feet. And this is, so it's more like working on mid and long term, especially when you need to implement a platform which is bridging people from different continents and different backgrounds. So the problem is how to create long-term perspective for these projects. How you could allow people to travel from Africa to Europe, for example, and develop part of their studies in one of your beautiful school of design in Portugal or somewhere else in London. It's still very hard. It's still very hard to break the barriers in terms. First of all, I have a sort of cultural shift on the question of migration. People doesn't have to migrate. I always migrate in my life, and I also always go back to my country in my life. So I migrate to study, and then I go back, and then I migrate to work. So it's a continuous fluxus, and we need to do this in the in connecting the global south with the rest of our planet within a continuous fluxus. People need to be very, very free in making their own journey, cultural and educational journey. If we are not generating this kind of fluxus, it will be very hard to somehow transform our way of thinking and designing and producing. So this is the very, very difficult step. It's trying to, for example, in our case, connect our African Fiber School with institutions, I would say European institution for long-term projects, exchanges, also allow European students to make their own researches in Africa, for example, which I think is quite interesting and actual. So this is the challenge. There is this rhetoric of putting a lot of money on Global South, putting a lot of money on ecological project, but just for implementing something, not to really give them the chance to keep walking and standing on their own feet.
Martin, do you want to add something to this discussion?
Sure, very briefly. Each country would have its own kind of research and financing culture, and sort of that needs to be navigated as well. But I would say in general, there is a tendency, and Arturo mentioned this in his presentation as well, towards technology, let's say, a technology-driven kind of research. So to think ecology and sort of needs to, at least if you work through design as I do, then there's a component that needs to be navigated in the current standards, and that is part of the difficulty as well as I see it, because it is truly an anthropocentric technology-driven culture that is being financed still, even though the talk is about ecological issues more increasingly, unfortunately. But we still not kind of really affected, or we're not as sensitive, to biodiversity, I would say, and we really need to be much closer. So at the way our cities are built, the way our artifacts are built, they're really separating rather than bring us closer to them. And I think that's part of the culture that we need to change. So it is a slow process, but it's happening, I believe.
Thank you. Just one question, then we will have to also finish, and I will give the floor to Ana Margarida. But I want to go back again to this discussion about education. As you all three of you are teachers, besides the fact that you are designers and practitioners, how can this logic of the projects that you are developing can be more present in academic education? How do you think we can bring this logic, not an isolated cases like yourselves or just like ourselves, but to embed a new paradigm in the design education? Martin.
I'm really active on that front. We're now creating a new master's at ConsFac, and so we really focus on what we call a design-driven eco-literacy. So we don't even talk about sustainability, but really trying to educate our students towards what we call eco-literacy through design. And this is key. We're doing this, but there are many. There's a new generation, or there are generations of people coming which are much more sensitive, that are being taught at the moment these issues, which we were not, when we were studying. And that's already very hopeful, I would say. But we're very much working with that actively, and I trust that we will find ways to navigate that as well, to become more sensitive and more attuned to all kinds of forms of life.
Yanki or Paolo, do you want to?
Yanki, please. Go ahead.
As I say from the beginning, I designed to leave academia, so I'm not directly related to any school, but I'm affiliated with many schools. So I think that may be the way to do it, instead of like having, Teresa, you're trying to, we were talking about challenging traditional design education, but there's so much system is fixed there, and I'm not sure one course can change the culture. So what I did, or what I designed to do, is actually I went to different schools, like doing different workshops, and I think it's more influential in that way, maybe trying to not inside the system, but actually influence from the outside. And I think this is also the thesis network have been, also some people have been doing, and there's a lot of network ongoing. So for example, I'm part of a very big network called the Share Campus through the Zurich University. And they've been doing these critical ecologies and doing share teaching between different schools. I think this is the way to do, it's not one design school can change, but this is a network, working, crossing different culture, bringing different students together. So sometimes they will come to my project. So I think my project become a case in the real world, and then they will come to work as an internship or part of the research team. So I think this may be something is still, I'm in the middle of questioning how can we do that? But as I decided to leave the system in order to change the system.
Thank you. And Paolo?
I was trying to do the opposite, honestly, trying to be in the system in order to change it from inside. I don't know who's wrong, who's right, but anyway, the question is a huge question, of course. I've been inside and outside the system for many years, and I have to say that something is changing. Of course, the practice is changing. So who we are educating? What is the kind of new profile in terms of designer or architects? What are the new clients for them? I mean, this is very important. The question of clients is changing as well. Some of the clients now are NGO, organized association of people. So I think that we have to work on this cultural shift. Thinking about new forms of clients, because in the end we need clients. So if we want to change this practice in a more ecological way, we need to have a more let's say a wider understanding of a more independent form of clients, and how students can learn to deal with this kind of clients, which are quite more complex and more informal and more somehow controversial, and also less maybe rich as well. So learn to negotiate in between programs, budgets. I think all these things are the more and more relevant in reality. And so we need to find a way to develop this kind of new educational perspective. Of course, my dream is always to create a new, and what we are trying to do in Africa and between Africa and Europe is to develop a new approach to educational. But the question is always how to sustain this and how to be very opportunistic with the system as well in order to sustain this. So it's a long question. I would love to keep discussing this sometime in another occasion.
Thank you. I hope we can continue the discussion in other channels and maybe other opportunities. I would like to leave the floor to Ana Margarida Ferreira to conclude.
Okay, well, thank you so much. This is my hard mission to finish this session, but I must do it. So before doing it, I must say that I would propose a complementary practice on that. That is a top-down and bottom-up approach, probably to make a change. So maybe we can explore it further in other sections. So in this case, in my name, in name of Porto Design Biennale, great team, and in name of the scientific committee of the second Colloquium, Caring for Diverse Kinship, thank you so much for being with us, and mostly for your knowledge, time, and attention. Teresa, also a big thanks for accepting more this challenge. So on behalf of all of us, let's keep in touch, work together, and explore synergic actions through and for design. There is a beautiful, diverse, and interconnected world all around us to be respected, explored, and I would say in new ways, and enjoyed. Last but not least, please stay safe and keep tuned. Next week we will have more. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Bye.